Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on the NAIA podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something called conflict fundraising. And we're super fortunate to have the person I view as the world renowned expert on this topic, Patti Strand. And she is the president and founder of the National Animal Interest Alliance. And so I just want to take a moment to allow Patti to say hello. Say hi to everyone,
Hello.
Patti. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. Happy to be able to talk to you this way.
Yeah, I think it's great. And this topic is so important because as you know, most of our listeners, really love animals. We really love animals. And you put NAIA together in essence to preserve the human animal bond. And so before we start talking about conflict fundraising, um, I think it might be important for those of us who don't know you as well, for you to share a little bit about your background and the purpose of NAIA and why this purpose, this focus of NAIA is so important to all of our animal loving listeners.
Oh, well, I am definitely an animal lover. My husband and I have raised Dalmatians for 54 years now. And I am, by education, my degree is in political science. And let's see, I was a realtor up until about 1988, 90, somewhere in there. That means I'm old, doesn't it, if I refer to dates like that? I say that was the beginning of
It
NAIA.
depends on
But
who you
anyhow,
ask. Yeah.
be that as it may, that's where we're at. But basically, at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, we began to see legislation aimed at animals that was different than any kind of legislation that we had seen in the past. I had worked with my local animal control agency, and so I was kind of familiar with how animal legislation came about. Usually, if there was a problem in the community, there would be a task force set up to deal with it. I'm thinking about things like dangerous dog situations, maybe a child was injured by a dog and they needed to take a look at the laws they had on the books to see if they were appropriate and so on. And you get a task force together and you might have, the person at one end that wanted to ban all breeds or, every breed that kind of looked like the one that bit their child. And then at the other end, you had people who thought it was always going to be the child's fault. And therefore, anyway, but in the middle, we were always able to come up with some reasonable kinds of policies. But at the beginning of the 90s, all reason just left animal legislation, and we were into something altogether different than any of us had experienced, and that was animal rights legislation, which not only, in addition to not being amenable to any kind of reasonable amendment, it always has a particular agenda and cannot be amended. But in addition, there was also a big media piece with it, so that the legislation and the so-called cause for the legislation was always on the nightly news, looking like it was a news story rather than a promotion of the animal rights agenda or that particular piece of legislation. In other words, the people behind this legislation were very sophisticated marketers, and they understood that in order to succeed with their legislation, they were going to need to convince the general public that there was a huge problem, and they would define it in such a way that the folks they were trying to basically get rid of, eliminate, looked like they were the cause of it. And so, I first became involved in the state of Oregon. There was a bill called Oregonians Against Puppy Mills. And who in the world would be for puppy mills? I don't know anybody that would be for puppy mills, but that, of course, is the beauty that exposes or shows you how clever their marketing is, right? I mean, nobody in the world would be against a bill that would ostensibly get rid of puppy mills. But in fact, the legislation was drafted in such a way it would have gotten rid of all breeders, no matter how responsible, no matter how humane. And it was more extreme for taking care of dogs than the laws on the books for taking care of children in daycare, to give you an idea of just how ridiculous it was. But it was unamendable. And bottom line result is that we stayed working on this bill for the entire session. It never went away till the end. I think that was one of the other agreements is, if you're going to carry this kind of legislation, maybe you're in a safe district to begin with, or maybe you're not ever going to run again. I don't know. But they find these people who understand right up front that people are going to come at them and want them to amend it, or they're going to want them to pull it, that their colleagues are going to ask them to pull it, and they have to kind of promise that they'll stick with it no matter how bad it gets. At least that is how it seems. So long story short, we wound up winning. At the very end, we were able to get a couple hundred people to show up at the Capitol, which is a big deal. And then subsequently, I was asked to write an article on how we engaged this bill and why we were successful. And to be honest with you, looking back, I have very little understanding of why we were acceptable at that particular point in time, other than we just stayed the course and we got lots and lots of people to come out and show up and so on. But after I wrote that article, the magazine, the publisher of the article, started getting threats from, God knows who, but he had been writing articles about animals for his, big part of his life. He had been with Vanity Fair previously. He was a great writer. And he said, I've never seen anything like this, but I'm getting these threats from people. And anyway, the reason he was getting threats was that I stumbled into a topic that was not politically correct to talk about, or that would perhaps create some hurdles for the animal rights movement. And that was that I mentioned that there was an animal rights agenda behind this bill. And bear in mind that 20 minutes before this bill hit, I didn't know that there was, I guess maybe as a background fact, I kind of had heard that there was something called an animal rights agenda or an animal rights movement, but it was never personalized to me. But in my article, I wrote that there seemed to be an animal rights agenda behind this. And I did not mention the name of any of the national groups that raise funds and promote these things. That was all I said. But it was enough to get the attention, apparently, of folks who didn't like it. So that intrigued me. And during the course of working on this legislation, I met people who were in farming. I met people who were in biomedical research. I met people who were in the hunting groups, and they all seemed to know what we were up against. They said, oh my gosh, you are experiencing what we've been experiencing for the last several years, which is this ridiculous, crazy animal rights agenda. We didn't think they'd come, even though pets are part of the overall agenda for elimination. We did not think that they would get to that for another 10 years or so. They've been so busy working on eliminating hunting and different kinds of farming practices and so on. And of course, the American public loves pets. So we just thought that you were going to be a ways down the road yet. Anyway, so I got to understanding that there was definitely something different going on, and that it was well organized, well funded, very zealous. By the way, at these hearings, people would stand up and cry and run out of the room because they couldn't stand to even think for another minute about these animals that were suffering as a result of the activities of people who farm or who raise dogs or who are associated with animals in research, etc. So it was very well orchestrated, very well marketed, and so on. And so I did another article. I wound up being pretty good friends with a gal I met who was with a group called Incurably Ill for Animal Research. She was a kidney recipient. She would have died without being able to have a kidney transplant. And she got me to go to a couple of her science fairs. And that is where I really understood what we were up against and how serious it was, and that it wasn't really a dog issue or a farm issue or a research issue, that it was something that could have just a profound effect on our overall society. And basically, that it was an anarchist movement that was opposed to pretty much every value that I held in terms of, representative government, and thinking that the discussion about all these things should be honest. I mean, I'm not a fool. I recognize that we live in a world where advertising plays a big role, and that there is, a degree of propaganda. But I guess the sophistication of the propaganda that we were up against was, you could tell that they were going to have an enormous effect on society long term. And of course, the other thing too for me, and this maybe is something you experienced too, Cindy, but at the beginning, when the movement was just getting started, they were also engaged in a lot of violence. There was the Animal Liberation Front. And so, sort of as a staccato background note, periodically here in Oregon, we'd have the fur farm at Oregon State burned down, or the research at University of Oregon attacked, and really expensive microscopes and other kinds of equipment destroyed because of the anti research component of the movement. And then we had a horse processing plant burned down, and a USDA building was burned. So so when I got started, there was a lot of violent activity as well as the legislative stuff that we've grown accustomed to over these last few years.
So you had a very personal experience, and you started to talk about that with the young woman you met who was a kidney transplant recipient, and you went to this science fair with her. And what happened exactly at that fair to this woman that got you thinking?
Yeah, I was standing in a booth with this sweet, wonderful person, and guy came up to the booth and he got closer than anybody else did. He aggressively or bullishly put his body closer to us than anybody else had. And he started shouting at her that she ought to be ashamed, that her life was not worth more than one of these animals that had died so that she could live. And then he spit on her. He was only about maybe 4 to 6 inches from her face at that point with his face. And it was really life changing for me. It was such an act of ugliness, and I guess I would have to say evil. The look in his face was so full of hate and rage that I think that really enabled me to see how unhinged some of the people in the movement were. That they had been propagandized. He was a true believer. Whatever horror story he was telling about research, he actually believed because he had absorbed so much of the half truths that are out there about all of the things that we do. And so that really set me on a path where I thought we needed to organize. And so brought together all the people from the different groups that I had met. And we're talking about people who are sincere, people who love animals, who probably are at the top of their fields in terms of developing the standards for animal welfare. These weren't just random people who thought, let's go protect our industry or something. These are people who, in many cases, had spent a lifetime trying to make sure that the lives of animals were improved. But there's this fundamental difference, right? The world that most people live in, the world that 97% of the public live in, is one in which they believe that that it is appropriate for people to utilize animals, to keep them as pets, to raise them for food, to utilize them in biomedical research and other things, so long as they are responsibly and humanely cared for. And there's an entire field that is dedicated to nothing but figuring out what that means and making sure that the proper standards are developed so that animals can be treated humanely. But the animal rights movement, the animal rights agenda, is opposed to all use of animals, no matter how responsible or no matter how humane. But the genius in their marketing is that they piggyback on every value that the American public has. And they start with making this a rights movement, right? The entire history of the West, of Western civilization, is based on the increase of rights for average people, right? Starting with the Magna Carta and landowners getting rights, and then advancing to all men, and then eventually women, and then in the civil rights era in the United States to African Americans and other minorities. So this is something that we all hold very dear. And so they piggybacked on that evolving Western ethic of ever greater rights for individuals. And so that's like the first step, or the first thing they did that was very, very smart. And I don't know if Cindy, did you ever read Animal Liberation by Peter Singer?
No, I haven't read it in its
Yeah, you should.
entirety
And of
yet.
course,
Yeah, I know.
yeah, it was written a long time ago, maybe before you were doing research.
Oh
I
yeah.
think I'm old. Do you suppose I'm getting old? Anyway,
I don't know.
so, but
Experience.
you know, it's a very interesting book, and it opens. You know, it starts at the very beginning, talking about this very thing, about the need to give animals rights. And of course, the thing they leave out is that in order to do that, since animals can't act on their own behalf, they have to create bureaucracies that they are going to be in control of to make sure that that happens. So it's all about transferring power.
Mm.
And so it's significant that Peter Singer was an avowed Marxist too. And I mean, a declared, self declared Marxist. It's not like somebody said he was, he said he was. And so, one of the main things that has to happen with Marxism is that power has to be shifted to other groups. There has to be a redistribution process that happens. And of course, looking at dog breeding, for instance, and the ongoing displacement of responsible breeders and good dogs with rescue groups that are nonprofit and in large measure work with this movement, which is not to say that all rescue is bad, because I personally do rescue, you do rescue. But, 30 years ago, we started talking about responsible breeding versus that other kind of breeding. And now we need to start talking about responsible rescue versus that other kind of rescue, because what we have today in many, many cases are fly by night kinds of rescues that simply are grabbing animals from any place they can find them so that they can sell them and call it an adoption, right?
Yeah. This plays into, I'm listening to what you're saying, and you recounted all of this violence against people who did anything with animals, like raise them for food for us to eat, you know, bred them so they could have pets, worked with them for the development of treatments. And all of this violence really was based on, misinformation that was provided by these groups, these animal rights groups, with this agenda that you mentioned, right? And folks were manipulated, but in order for them to be manipulated, they had to lack some information, just some basic information. And I think it's notable, and I read recently that about 70%, of Americans today don't have any direct hands-on experience with
Yeah,
animals outside of
that's
pet ownership, right? And
right.
and I'm wondering how you think that has something to do with their ability to being so manipulated, by the animal rights folks.
When you think about it, our grandparents, or at least mine, were in an era where horses were replaced by cars. America was still very rural. The shift from rural to urban lifestyles, the shift from physical activity, actually, if you had a horse, you had to take care of it every day. You had to learn something about husbandry. And that knowledge is just gone. Husbandry was something that everybody learned. And, when people had a gift for husbandry, it was just like today we think, oh my gosh, my son has an ear for music. It was recognized that some people had not only a special love for animals, but an ability to work with animals in ways that other people didn't. And so we do. We have this giant vacuum today. The only experience that people have today is in working with their pets. And of course, they love their pets. But in many cases, Cindy, and this is amazing, people don't know where their pets come from. They have
Mm.
to come from someplace, right? There is a source for these animals. There are people who breed these animals. And of course, during the transition from rural to urban, we had this enormous overpopulation problem because there was a period of maybe 3 or 4 decades where people had to learn how to live with their animals in an urban setting. Living on a farm that has acreage and lots of outbuildings and, great room for the dogs to run and roam and all those kinds of things. And when you move to a 50 by 100-foot lot in the city, you have to manage your animals differently. So there was a period of time where there was a genuine and serious overpopulation problem. People were letting their animals breed like they had in these rural settings and didn't have homes for them. And so they would take them in baskets to their local shelter for, euphemistically for placement. But in many cases, they had to be euthanized because there were just too many. So you have that as a backdrop, something that was real, that was a problem for a
Mm.
lot of years. And you have this growing love and people bringing animals into their house. We still have enormous ignorance about how animals are raised, how they're cared for, who is producing them, and how they're being produced, and just this love that we have when we're with them. And there's a displacement that happens in that transaction.
So you have people who really don't have any working knowledge of the things that folks who lived in rural environments who worked with animals have, right? And so what they have is just this tremendous love for their animals, just like the rest of us, right? But in the absence of all that other information, they fall prey to these misinformation campaigns by these animal rights groups, right?
Yeah.
And which almost always takes the form of some sort of legislation that ends up harming the animals in the end, right? And this is sort of what brought you into this so passionately, back in the day when people were trying to end all the dog breeding and, adopt, don't shop, and all of this other stuff that you sort of mentioned before, right? But one of the main distinctions, I think, that you developed in yourself and that you talk about today is that people aren't getting that animal rights is not the same thing as animal welfare, right? I mean,
Completely
so
dis-
you are a strong proponent for animal welfare, not animal rights. And I think I don't know that everybody, even who's listening, understands that distinction. Maybe you can just give us quickly, like a brief explanation of what that difference is, so people can decide what category they really fit into.
Yeah, well, we know that about 97% of the public believes in animal welfare because that is the percentage of people who choose to use animal products for food, right? There are people, ovo-lacto vegetarians that, are eating eggs and milk, but 97% of the public utilizes animals for food. And so they do at some level believe in the responsible and humane treatment of farm animals, right? That's a starting point. I think that people don't really recognize how reliant they are on animals for practically every aspect of their life, whether we're talking about companionship, whether we're talking about almost every drug in their medicine cabinet was worked out at some point, or some of its ingredients were tested utilizing animals. Certainly, something like 70% of the public keeps a pet. Many families go to zoos and other kinds of animal entertainment and educational events. So we know that the overwhelming majority of people believe that it is responsible to utilize animals so long as they are cared for properly. That is the essence of animal welfare.
Right.
On the other hand, animal rights does not believe that it is appropriate for people to utilize animals for any purpose, for research, for clothing, for food, for companionship. Certainly, it's not appropriate for sportsmen to ever hunt an animal, even though they would utilize it for food, and even though it may be overpopulating on its own and might be better for the animal and the environment to do so. So that's really it. It's a non-use philosophy. The ideology says it is not appropriate to utilize animals. One of the things that we noticed in the last 10 years is that so many of the things that they preached as to be opposed, they are now doing now that they are the ones that are in charge of these animals. And this is true whether or not they've taken them out of a laboratory and they've claimed that these animals are being mistreated, so they have to set up their own sanctuary, or these animals in a particular zoo are not being treated well, so they have to take them to their own sanctuary. In so many cases, and maybe a majority of cases, but certainly a lot of them that I know about, these animals are not treated as well as they were in their original habitat. So you see this redistribution factor that I talked about earlier. It's not a little thing, it's a big thing. It's about power, it's about who decides. At
Hmm.
the end of the day, for the people who are deeply involved in this movement, and when I say movement, not everybody has an ideological stake in it. They have a stake in it maybe for money, for power, for a lot of things that are extremely important to them. And so the ideology is something that they use, but it's very very effective. And then the fundraising that goes along with that. If you just say animals are not being treated well, there are some people who are mistreating animals. I think all of us who are on the animal welfare side, well, we would say, of course, and those people should not be allowed to have animals. They should not be allowed to work with animals if they are abusive people. And people in animal welfare would say that. But The thing that gives the kick to the way that the animal rights movement operates their agenda is that they say no one under any circumstance should use animals. It's just wrong. You wouldn't use another person in this way, so it's wrong to use an animal this way. Different philosophy altogether. But it also, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, let's stick with that for a minute, and because
Okay.
I see where you're going with this, and I want to have some time to talk about that, the conflict fundraising model, right? But
Okay.
sticking with this right here, right? So you're right. I mean, people care about animals, right? And we love animals, and that makes us sort of really fabulous targets for manipulation by people with an alternative agenda, right? But
Right.
let me ask you a question. You know, when I talk to people in the public, and maybe I point out something that PETA has done, or HSUS has done, or White Coat Waste has done, that's, it seems counterintuitive to them because, whatever example I'm giving in the end causes harm to the animals, right? And these people will say to me, "Well, why would they do that? I mean, don't they care about animals, don't they?" And this is a question I have for you. Do people who subscribe to this animal rights philosophy? We're not talking about people who believe in animal welfare, right? The agenda. Do people who subscribe to that animal rights philosophy, do they have a love for animals in that same sort of mainstream human animal bond sense that most of us think of?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you'd pose the question that way because I was talking about Peter Singer earlier in his book, Animal Liberation, and he just starts out at the very beginning of it telling you he didn't have that kind of affection for animals, that he didn't think about animals the way that most people do. He just thought that they should not be utilized. But I would say that, I've worked in this a great long time now, and many people who deeply subscribe to the animal rights agenda and ideology do love animals. They do. They love them deeply. They are in. It becomes a religion to them. It isn't just a philosophy and ideology. It is part of their entire lifestyle and being. And they do, in many cases, keep animals, maybe more than they should. But for the most part, you have leaders in many of these movements that are just extremely good at fundraising and extremely good at understanding that people outside their group cared very deeply about animals. It's one of those wedge issues. It's like the abortion issue in that regard. Everybody loves babies and everybody loves animals. And so you are able to manipulate emotions all day long.
What you said is that what they want is for us to have no interactions with animals at all, right? I imagine that a world controlled by the animal rights movement would just, what would a world like that look like?
Well, I mean, that's the thing that we want to prevent, but really and this is going to go sideways on you, but I think that we will still have animals. They'll just be, in the case of pets, they'll come from Africa and South America, and eventually the shelters will begin to breed them themselves. I mean, that's the direction we're going right now. And so the philosophy is at odds with its own results.
So NAIA spends almost all of its time trying to educate the public with actual facts, right? And create clarify this distinction between animal welfare and animal rights, appealing to their love for animals, but restoring some logic and rationale to it all, right? So that we can continue to enjoy this human animal bond that so much of us, really require. I mean, I do. I require it to live, right? But the animal rights movement hates what we do. They hate what you do, right? It's every time somebody like yourself comes up with an initiative or goes out to educate the public and speak to this part of them that really is interested in animal welfare. The animal rights people hate it. I mean, you've been attacked verbally, you've been threatened. Your family's been threatened. Why would people who, I mean, you say they do care about animals? Why do the animal rights people have such a hard time with people promoting animal welfare?
I think it's a displacement kind of thing. They want to be the people in charge of the microphone, and and in fact they are. They own the conversation in the United States today. They are totally in control of it. And so I think again, when we are effective in delivering our message, we compete with what they're trying to do, and they are after our elimination. and they're after basically taking and doing what we do. I don't know. I would bet anything that at some point in time, the animal rights people will be doing certain kinds of research using animals. Seriously.
Mm.
You asked me a minute ago, you said, do you believe that the people who have this philosophy love animals? And I mean, there's a big distinction because you have the people at the top of the movement, like the people like Peter Singer and others who founded it, who are clearly manipulating people for other purposes, and they have no interest in animals, at least as far as keeping them as pets, petting them. They don't get any love, any benefit from that. That's not where they're at. It's ideological and political for them. But the people who have absorbed the misinformation, let me back up. When we first started, I heard from a woman who had been captured by some of the most extreme animal rights groups out there. And this is before the internet really took off. And she described her lifestyle to me. And she said that she would get a video from one of these groups at least once a month, and she would wait with her heart for the next one she would get because they were so compelling and so emotional for her. And they would be videos that would show animals basically being tortured. Like, for instance, she talked about one where they were ostensibly grinding up live animals for food. And it was horrific. And she believed that that was going on. I don't know if she ever questioned where somebody could get a film like this. I mean, seriously, if you were the one doing it, would you do a film of it yourself? Anyway, a lot of questions about where those films came from. But she talked about how it affected her life. And I mean, she was, so you asked me a minute ago if these people believe it. Well, some of them really do, because the degree of propaganda that they've been exposed to is absolutely horrific. I mean, you're talking about this, serial killer type people being, shown as representative of a particular group of people. I mean, they find the black sheep or they manufacture the black sheep. Who knows, really? I mean, for some of the films she described, it's hard to believe that even if somebody was doing it, that they'd film themselves. So where did the film come from? Who made it? So that's a distinction I want to make from what I was talking about earlier, that there is this political, ideological, and I would add to that fundraising element at the very top of the movement where you have no idea whether or not they even care about animals. But you also have people who are sincerely misled and have been propagandized in a way that is just utterly unethical and horrific. And so I've met those people too, and I think I gave you an answer that you might not have expected on that. But I know people who absolutely love animals and truly believe that people like you and me would enjoy or just not even notice if we tortured animals. It would be just fine. So they actually believe that, and that's a big problem.
That brings us right to the heart of the topic for today, right? So now we have landed squarely in the conflict fundraising arena. Explain to and it's not a new thing, right? I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about here, this conflict fundraising. Explain the model of conflict fundraising for our listeners so that they can understand and recognize what's really happening when they see these horrific films, or they read these horrific stories. Talk about conflict fundraising.
Yeah, or even the beautiful short videos, ads that are on television with people singing and showing you pictures of, dogs that are in horrible situation. You don't even know they could be filming in Peru or someplace. You don't know where they come from or what the backstory really is. But yeah, you have a situation where overwhelmingly people love animals. It's instinctive for normal people to care about animals. And I think there have been a couple of studies that show that love for animals sort of bypasses the frontal cortex too. I mean, it's very easy to manipulate people over animals because we all love them so much. And so what the model is they come up with images of people who are, as I described earlier, just the most horrific wretches of humanity that actually do or would or could be made to seem that they torture animals in the worst way possible. They find or present pictures of animals that have been harmed. They'll give you a backstory about what happened to the animal. It could have been run over, could have been off its property and run over, but they will say that somebody deliberately beat it into this condition. So they find there are three elements to what you're asking about. There's the victim, the animal, the villain, who they claim is responsible for whatever suffering that you see in the animal that's presented to you on the end of a chain or whatever it might be. And then they ride into town as the saviors, the vindicators. It's in when you look at this in books that deal with public relations, it's villain, victim, vindicator. The vindicator is the person who rides in on the white horse to save the day. And that is the role of these national animal groups that at one time in history were animal welfare groups. You go back to the history of most of the national groups that exist today. Some of them started, in the 1800s and for legitimate reasons because they saw that horses were being overworked and were, just being mistreated. And so most of these groups arose at a time when people were becoming more urbanized, so you could actually see how animals were being treated. Some of them weren't being treated well, and they set out to change that. And so they have a history of, decades and decades, maybe close to 100 years of legitimately working for animal welfare. But the money is just too great on the animal rights side for many of these groups to stick with animal welfare. They've gotten into something that is sensational enough, provocative enough so that they can raise a lot of money. And to raise a lot of money, you need that villain. Without the villain, if you only have animals in need and there's nothing that they can do to convince you that you should send them money. But if there's a villain, they can tell you that somehow they're going to get rid of that. Of course, they use their legislation to convince the public that they're trying to eradicate those really bad people. But unfortunately for everybody, whether you're in research, whether you're in farming, whether you are a sportsman, whether you're raising dogs and cats, whatever you're doing with animals, they always draft the legislation so broadly that it affects far more than the individuals that actually are doing a bad job. And of course, there's always a black sheep in every industry. I don't care what you do in life, and it doesn't have to be involved with animals. If your goal is to find a black sheep, is to find a bad example, you can find that in medicine, in law, in raising animals, whatever. And so it's open season. They're able to accomplish their agenda pretty easily.
Or, I mean, in the case of research, they just misrepresent so many things because they
Oh, yeah.
can, because the public's entirely ignorant about how the process and research works. And I think the same is true in farming and many other fields, right? So, it's like they are applying this formula of victim, villain, vindicator, however they have to apply it, right? So that they can make their money, right? And they pull the media and the politicians right in. I mean, why is conflict fundraising so effective? When it comes to the media's response and the response by politicians, when what's at stake here is our ability to maintain our relationships with animals. I mean, how is it so effective? How do they fall for that? What's going on?
What is that line about the media? If it bleeds, it leads. It's just a natural marriage, right? I mean, they're looking for provocative um, items that they can put on television, and people love animals. Look at how many animals are in commercials. Going back to this instinctive love that we have for animals, it is generalized really across the population. Maybe these few people like Peter Singer are not in that group, but it's a small percentage of people who don't automatically respond to animals. And so they're in all the commercials. And then if a newsman is given a provocative story that they know that they're going to get a lot of readership or viewership. Eyeballs, I guess is the word for it. So, yeah, I mean, there's a natural marriage that's happening there. And so the public gets misled more and more and more. Yeah, it would be, but we've seen this. I mean, propaganda is sort of the name of the game in the United States today. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about animals, it is all about getting the eyeballs. It's about having anything that's provocative enough to keep viewers paying attention.
Hmm. But many
And
of our politicians are also easily manipulated by this villain, victim, vindicator model. I mean, why? You think their role is to protect us, right, and to address our needs as a society, and yet,
and only to their role and job of getting reelected.
mm,
And if they believe that the public believes the lie. If they believe that they have a big constituency who is really moved by this information, they are going to go with it. So yeah, we have just a giant job on our hands in clarifying the misinformation. But our problem, or not our problem, but our hurdle is that we do try to present things honestly. We're not trying to be hyperbolic. We're not out there, being provocative by just saying one more thing that isn't quite true to get the attention that we need. And it is the culture too. I mean, think about the products, the way that products are advertised. It's like, every place you look, things are being presented in ways that are just not quite true.
Mm-hmm.
And in the animal issue, I mean, it really is a serious thing. If you are an anarchist, and this was founded by anarchists, this movement started in England with anarchists and with people that got together after the end of the Vietnam War. And all of the identity politics we have today emerged at that same time. How do you get people to do what you want them to do? You divide them up, you tell them that this group is against them and that group is against them, and pretty soon they're working for you, is sort of how all of this comes together. So the original groups in England were anarchist groups, and they found that anarchists cannot raise money because obviously they're breaking the law, so they can't put an ad in the newspaper or tell the public who they are. So they started working with nonprofit animal groups. The first one in England was the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. And in fact, the executive director, or maybe it was the president, but some high up official at that organization came over and became the executive director for PETA in the United States in the 80s. But they developed the model. And again, it goes back to this conflict fundraising model where you'd have these anarchists that would come forth and they would interrupt hunts or they would break into laboratories. Again, they had to do so anonymously, otherwise, they'd get sent to jail. So they would tell their sad story to a group that was an above ground group that could go to the media with it and get a lot of attention on the issue. And then guess what? Send money to that organization for being the one to expose it or whatever. So that's the model. It's been with us since the absolute beginning. It was imported into the United States from England, where it started. But the anarchist portion of this is really, that is something that has always been. I love animals. That's what grabs me because I was involved with animals. But there's a broader issue here too, and it's that everybody in society is dependent on animals. Again, whether they realize it or not, they are. So if you want to have harm, if you want to harm a particular society, this is a very, very effective mechanism for doing so. And I think about, and you know this, Cindy, how much research has now been shipped to foreign countries where they have no standards at all. We have food production being shipped to other countries. We have drug manufacturers manufacturing being shipped to other countries. And now we have the outsourcing of pets to other countries. Here's the irony, right? Many of these shelters that work with the national groups have passed one law after another to eliminate everybody who produces dogs, right? They're all puppy mills, right? So we have to get rid of backyard breeders. They would be bad. So everybody spayed and neutered their dogs. They have outlawed pet stores, so they're out of business. The number of people who are hobby breeders today is a fraction of what it was 30 years ago. So guess what? There's a shortage of locally or even American bred dogs to such a degree.
Responsibly, right,
Yeah,
responsibly raised
responsibly.
dogs,
Yeah, they got
right.
rid of the
There's a
responsible.
shortage of responsibly raised dogs in the United
That's
States. Yeah,
exactly right.
right.
Yeah,
No,
it's
I'm
it's
and
it's
keep
huge.
talking about yeah, and what's happening now because it's exactly I mean, we have a current day product of this conflict fundraising nonsense
Yeah,
that is
yeah,
harming us and also
right.
harming animals, right? We can't get from this country, it's hard for us to get responsibly bred dogs. And so instead, what they've done, and that's what's so twisted about this movement to me, right? What's happening now? Because I know that you're involved with something very directly right now that speaks specifically to the dog issue and our ability to have all the pets that we demand in this country. Tell everybody what's going on because it's just unbelievable. Yeah.
working on a bill called the Healthy Dog Importation Act. And basically, it doesn't restrict really or limit dogs from coming in the United States, but the big problem that we've seen as so-called humane relocation, again, caused by the fact that many of the responsible sources have dwindled to such a small level now that there are not enough dogs to meet demand being produced in the United States. So CDC reported in 2019 that the previous year over 1 million dogs were imported. And the problem is none of them are vetted. Now, as everybody in America knows, there's been a lot of political discussions and concern about the number of humans coming across the border, in part because of various diseases that are prevalent in some of the developing countries that we don't have here. I mean, we've had worries about Ebola and different things at different times. Well, the dogs that are coming in are bringing in diseases with them that we have not had in our populations here for a long time. Rabies is one of them. It was considered to be eradicated in canines in the United States back in 2007, but we're having it reintroduced. We're having it reintroduced not only from foreign sources, but because of just humane relocation from one state to another by people who are not regulated in the way that all the people that they have eliminated are regulated. So this so-called humane relocation is neither humane nor responsibly done. There's responsible rescue. Dalmatian Club of America, Doberman Pinscher Club of America, all of the different breed clubs have done rescue for 30 or 40 years, and there are standards that they have to meet. But what's happening with rescue in the United States is it is, simply become the new pet stores, only they're unregulated. So again, we see that transfer of who's in charge. Again, I said earlier, it's not about the animals, it's about who decides. It's about who's in charge. And that's where we are.
You know what? Let me tell you what bothers me about this so much. So what they've done effectively is create an underground market. It's not even underground. They've created a
Yeah, it is.
market, right? They've created a market for poorly treated or poorly raised dogs, right? So now we have all these rescue groups. They're all going, to these other countries, and they're collecting everybody's money because there are all these do-gooders, and they're going to rescue these dogs from a bad situation. When in fact, what they're doing is they're creating a market for those people to continue to raise dogs in improper conditions and mistreat them, so that they can then be rescued, right? And so it's a pipeline, not a solution, right? Nobody's going over there and saying, hey, you know what? It's not okay for you to do that. Like, with all that money they're getting from the American people, right? Why don't they take it and go over there and create solutions? Well, they don't. Instead,
Well,
they're encouraging more and more of this behavior,
that's
right?
right.
They're basically saying, yes, please continue to mistreat dogs so we can continue to take money from the American people because we're rescuing them. And then of course they bring all this stuff into the United States, just like you said, right? And
Yeah. Oh,
so
yeah.
what would this Healthy Importation Act do? The healthy import. Well, it was a healthy dog. What would this healthy dog? What is this Healthy Dog Importation Act going to do for us? And where are we with this?
Yeah, well, it's in good shape. It is in both the House and the Senate version of the Farm Bill. And so if we ever get a Farm Bill passed, it's overdue now. We believe that it will pass. And it's really a reasonable law. It simply requires that the animals that we're bringing in have reasonable veterinary oversight before they come in, that they're vaccinated and that they're microchipped, so that if there is a problem, we can trace it back. We have had a number of dogs come in that have had rabies. Rabies is forever. People die from it, right? If you interact with a dog that has rabies and you're bitten or you wind up in contact with bodily fluids, you can wind up being infected. And nobody who has ever been infected that has had symptoms develop before they realized they were infected has lived. So it's a pretty darn serious disease. But that's not, I mean, there are vector-borne diseases that are just horrific too, that are coming in from tropical areas. There's something called leishmaniasis, which literally winds up eating the mucous membranes around your eyes. No, I mean, it's just a god awful, horrible disease. And if you want to look want to read a little bit about it, you can go to National Geographic and just put in leishmaniasis. It'll talk about some scientists that went to Central America and came back with it, and it's like 10 years later and they can't get rid of it. It's very, very serious. And brucellosis, lots and lots of cases of brucellosis. These are all diseases that are zoonotic, means people can get them. Certainly means they can transmit them to other pets too. So that's a big issue for us. If you get brucellosis in your kennel, and we've bred dogs for 54 years, we have a bloodline we have worked so carefully to develop so that it is healthy and so that it is orthopedically sound and so that they have good temperaments and all those things you work on. And all you have to do is get brucellosis in your kennel, and it's over. You have to euthanize the dogs, most of them, and they could never be bred again. And they find that even after they are neutered, they can still shed it, and so they're running around American parks like crazy now. Dogs that are shedding this disease. So anyway, so we wanted to at least protect our animals and people from some of the diseases that they're carrying, and just put a little bit of responsibility into that pipeline you're talking about, because it is a pipeline. It's interesting because people care so much. Every single one of these animals that comes in has a backstory. They all have a tragic story to sell to the American public. And I think about that from the standpoint of being, a responsible breeder myself. If I had backstories like any one of these dogs, these same people would probably do a story about me in the local newspaper about how bad I am. But they're bringing in dogs that have every kind of problem under the sun. And for the poor adopters, when they bring in dogs, even from the south of the United States or from the tropics, heartworm is a really big issue. And, heartworm is treatable, but for young couples adopting a dog, and they're well motivated, they simply want to help an animal in need, they take it in and they wind up, they can hardly afford the house they're renting or the apartment they just got, and they've got to spend $1,000 or more just cleaning up this problem that the dog has. So anyway, our bill just creates some reasonable standards. They have to. Right now, what's happening very often is that there's something that has developed called rescue tourism. And with that, what people that have big shelters in different countries around the world will go to airports, and they'll find an American that's going to be going back to the United States, and they'll have papers ready, and they just ask them to carry them like they're their own dogs. So and the reason we've had rabies, even with some of the groups that are trying to be a little bit responsible, when you're picking up street dogs, if they've already been exposed to rabies or some other lethal disease, rabies in particular, until they're symptomatic, you can't tell. And so they would give them a shot right before they put them on the plane. Well, the shot may slow down symptoms, but it won't eradicate the ultimate development of rabies. And so that's where we saw some of the cases of rabies developing. And the big concern that we had about rabies in particular is that if these animals wind up in facilities, in shelters, or in rescue groups, a lot of dogs in that setting are nervous and agitated. And those are also the first symptoms of rabies. And so just the ability to detect it in that kind of environment is a little rougher than it would be under normal circumstances. And then the other thing that the bill does, requiring some kind of permanent identification, is when you get a case, you need to be able to track that dog back to its source. We have a case of rabies in Colorado today, and it's from a domestic dog. Same kind of issues can develop. If you're picking up street dogs and you pick up a dog that is unowned and therefore maybe never vaccinated properly, and it happens to live in a state where you have foxes or some other animal that has rabies, and you just randomly put them on a car and track them across the country, it is really a hardship. It costs, by the way, when CDC has to trace this back, it costs between $250,000 and $500,000 each time, because of the number of people that interact with the animals along the way. And I have not read yet what the recent Colorado case has resulted in cost-wise, but a lot of people interacted with this rabid dog along this pipeline, which was bringing dogs to two areas that no longer have a local supply, which is Colorado. In Colorado, something like, I don't know, a third of all the dogs are coming in from out of state. And of those, about 50% are puppies. So they're also being bred for this marketplace. There's no question about it. We were talking about the pipeline earlier, and I want to mention that in addition to picking up random dogs off the street and bringing them in from foreign countries, domestically, many of the larger rescue groups work regularly with the kinds of kennels that were put out of business that can't meet USDA standards. And they buy their dogs for a nominal amount and basically keep these really bad actors in business. And we know this.
Mhm.
I'm not saying that they all do this, but we know for sure that some of them do.
So
So that's what we got. We have this total displacement. Who's in charge? Who gets to decide? And meanwhile, the people who are actually working hard to do the right thing for the right reasons and understand animal husbandry and so on have been made to appear to be the bad guys.
yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. You have, this a society full of people who just love animals and are they're being had, right? They're giving all their money to these groups who are manipulating them. They're being had, and now, I mean, in this last example, now these people are actually harming public health, right? They're attacking the health of American citizens and their pets. I mean, it should be criminalized, right? But I love what you're doing with this bill because it's just sort of implementing some safeguards here to protect us because clearly their activity is not going to stop. And mainly that's because so many of us are going to continue to be had by these people. We're being bamboozled, right? And so I think, in closing, uh, some really important guidance from you, I think, to close this episode out would be, if we're speaking to the American public, all of these people who love animals, who are just being manipulated by these animal rights groups and their agenda, who keep funding them, not knowing that they're funding these harmful acts, right? How can these people recognize that they're being bamboozled in this messaging? They see an image or they hear a story. What advice would you give them that would prevent them from being manipulated and actually joining forces with an organization that's harming animals, doing the opposite of what they intended? How can they start to recognize that they're being manipulated, and how do they avoid that?
Well, that has been the 33-year mission of NAIA. It would be to help the public, to clarify, to counter the misinformation, to clarify the half-truths, and enable people to be able to distinguish reality from the propaganda that's out there. But I think that when you find yourself being really emotionalized by what you see related to an animal issue and then ask to do something, whether it's send money or go to the Capitol and vote, that you need to step back. You need to ask some questions. You need to do some research. Hopefully, you'll come to the NAIA website or actually contact our group because every single person on our board is a subject matter expert in their particular field, whether it's research or horses or dogs or ranching, farming. And we are, again, everybody, no matter who you are in life, you have some bias. You're looking through some filter. Our filter is actually working with the animals day in, day out, and actually caring. I don't think anybody in our group is making the money that any of that's what's so funny. They call breeders greeters, right? That is, again, their marketing, greeters. It's like, oh yeah, it's all about the money. Well, it's a little bit of projection on their part because it is literally all about the money when you really start looking at these groups. One of the groups that we looked at real quick, and I know you want to wrap this up, is a group that was that did in fact import a dog that had rabies. We looked up their 990 when they first started, and I think the first year they started, they had some nominal amount, like they raised $70,000 or $80,000 or something. They had raised $2 million by the end of about their fourth year. So this stuff pays. This is really, people care that much about animals that they will, if somebody tells them that an animal is being tortured or that people shouldn't breed or that they shouldn't raise or that there's no way research can be conducted responsibly, they will send money. So
Yeah.
there you are. But come to NAIA. We are the truth tellers, and we care greatly, and we strongly believe in the human animal bond. We can't imagine a time. I mean, people have lived with animals since they crawled out of the caves, right? And dogs are man's best friend for a reason. They were with him right at the very beginning. The relationship we have is the oldest relationship that people have with any other species. It is deep, important, and we're here to keep it.
Oh,
So
I love it.
that's
I
it.
love it so much. Yeah, I mean, I live and die for the human animal bond. I agree with you. And I appreciate so deeply everything that you, Patti Strand, and the National Animal Interest Alliance that you created has done and continues to do to preserve that bond. So thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with us today. If you just give our listeners the website, the NAIA website, what the URL is, and then we'll say goodbye to everyone. So,
The website is naiaonline.org, and a lot of people just call us NAIA. So thank you. Thank you, Cindy. This is a mutual admiration society for sure. We all just adore you and the work that you've done. You have been a leader in all of this in the research community.
I'm just going to say you've been a true mentor to me, and I appreciate you very very much. All
Thank
right,
you.
folks. As soon as you get done listening to this, go to your computers and check out the NAIA website, and you'll find all of the different programs that NAIA is involved with as well, including Homes for Animal Heroes, the one in which we rehome research dogs, and we have Discover Animals website, and the Get Real podcast is hosted by the NAIA group. A lot of really amazing information there, so much to learn. If you want the facts, go to where the facts are. And the facts
Yeah.
are at naiaonline.org.